across Newcastle and the Hunter to URFM 103.7 as we have a look at some of the things happening in the world of politics. We do that with our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose. Welcome, mate.
Good morning, Mark.
Glad to have you with us once again. And today, a nice general topic, so we'll probably actually agree on most of the points on this one.
Well, you never know.
You never know what's going to happen.
It's a possibility.
Liberal versus illiberal democracies, not the party but the concept.
Yes. There was a news story earlier today coming out of Portugal where what many people would describe as a far-right party, they self-describe as a populist party, but back 3 years ago they had one seat in the parliament, which was not very many, right? 3 years later, at the next round of elections, 12 seats. They've increased their...
That's a decent rise. I think any minor party would be happy with that.
Yes, yeah. And they're beginning to flex their muscles. Now, okay, the Portuguese situation is self-contained, shall we say. It's got its own dynamics going, but there's a generalised drift, shall we say, to a more rightward form of party. And one of the things that stood out with this particular party that says, okay, we're populist, we're for the people. And then they make the claim that they are for an illiberal democracy, a democracy in which the sorts of liberal democratic norms that we take for granted, that we assume is a normal part of a democratic society, these are to be scaled back. And by scaled back, it's the sorts of changes that get made, which we've seen happen in Poland, in Hungary, in some of the democratising countries in which the outward face of democracy appears to be the case, but the internal workings of the political regime, the political system, constrains the way in which citizens are allowed to operate. The things that we would say take for granted in Australia, some of those freedoms are no longer in operation. And I've put a bracket around that as well, Mark, because there are aspects of, shall we say, governing in Australia that's happened over a long, long period where we're quite prepared to sacrifice various liberal democratic principles in order to achieve other objectives. But we'll come back to that.
It's a whole other discussion. Because a big asterisk on that, lots aren't, but we've gone down that road anyway. Is there I'm sure there is a philosophy in political science that deals with this, because the way I look at that is if you look at the very furthest right that you can get and the very furthest to the left, so the type of things you're talking about here versus the big socialist communists like China, North Korea, and places like that. The further you get on each of those poles, a lot they start to sound very much the same, at least in their ideology. Yes,
well, certainly. I mean, there was popular for a long time in discussions of ideology a sort of horseshoe theory, that on one of the poles of the horseshoe was very far left, authoritarian dictatorship. Vis-a-vis the former Soviet Union, for example, or the current Chinese regime. On the other hand, on the other pole of the horseshoe is the very far right, which we would then characterise perhaps in its most extreme as fascism or Nazism, etc. Now, that was a sort of popular way of understanding it, but it was built around Cold War ideology and a sort of tendency to equate Soviet communism with Nazism, because they were both authoritarian and certainly non-liberal in our sense, our understanding. But what we're finding, or what we're seeing happen in a number of countries, and for some time now, where they've become what we started out saying illiberal democracies, where they have the trappings of a democracy, but internally things that we would take for granted, the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, etc. We're seeing in various countries regimes do their best to ensure that the courts are subservient to the politics of the day, to the regime in charge. So instead of being independent and able to adjudicate various things, the courts find themselves in very narrow channels where they have to sort of more or less toe the line with the regime. Similarly with the rule of law, and where instead of the rule of law being seen as independent of individuals, the regime uses the rule of law in ways that benefit the regime but not necessarily the wider citizens. And, you know, I realise that you have a particular soft spot for the former president of the US, but we have seen...
You beat me to the US on this.
Some of his actions could be seen very much in this light, where the rule of law was what he believed the rule of law should be rather than what the court should be, and the court should be subservient to what he believed was the appropriate way to go.
Big flip side on that, though. I mean, many are arguing, and my POV here is that quite rightly that the current regime over there is weaponising their judicial system. I knew that word had tripped me up. So there's swings and roundabouts on that, I guess.
Oh, of course. And depending on which side of the fence you happen to sit on, if those in power are allowing, shall we say, the authorities to pursue particular investigations, we would want that to be independent of what those in power are doing. By the same token, we would also be wanting to hold those in power to account if they stood idly by while somebody appears to be breaking the law and it's not investigated.
So here's a side point on this. How do you actually... I mean, yes, independence and, you know, separation of and all of that, but how do you actually get that? Because, I mean, if you're in the judicial system and you look at basically who is power, regardless of who is in power, and if you see them having this long-term stretch, I mean, how do you go, and I'm going to sit over here and be independent when the system that you're a part of is, I mean, there's a lot of...
It's a really big, difficult question, I think, Mark. It's it's at the heart of politics in many ways, and understanding how power is exercised and the way it operates. But for the most part, when we talk about power in a liberal democratic society, one of the key things is that when there's an election, and let's assume that it's a free and fair election, we'll take Australia as a case in point, when the election is over and the votes are counted, the outcome is then accepted by both sides. And if there are disputes, it goes to an independent arbiter like the Court of Disputed Returns or whatever. And so there are mechanisms put in place where these things can be sorted out. What we've seen happen in the US, however, has been a sort of tribalising of the ways in which electoral processes work. And numerous people understood that the claims of the former president about the nature of the election were, shall we be really charitable and say exaggerated or downright false.
Well, if you want to look at that too, I mean, again, if we can do the tennis match and tit for tat all day long as well,
yes.
Because I'm sure that the candidate that didn't get up in 2016, the one that everyone was the one that was supposed to win in inverted commas, is still somehow thinking that the president that actually came in after her was there because of the Russians, which was, again, a load of garbage. So, I mean, you can do this all day long.
Well, every loser
exactly
believes that somewhere along the line they got dudded. But one of the principles of a liberal democracy, one that we would hope holds firm in Australia, is that when the election's over and the numbers are counted and the result is declared, we accept the outcome. It's when losing sides don't accept the outcome, and we can go country hopping around the world looking at what happens when a side loses the election and then they refuse to accept the result. Quite often there's political turmoil, all sorts of problems arise. Part of a liberal democracy is accepting the outcome of the election, and it's incumbent, I think, on the political apparatus and those who make the decisions to ensure that the electoral process is as fair and as equitable as possible, so that when the votes are counted, we can be confident that the outcome is a reflection of what the voters cast.
One thing we know, that there's always an election around the corner somewhere in the country and around the world, and there's always a lot of intrigue that pre, during and following. As always, Jim, a pleasure. We'll catch you next time around, eh?
Yep, and yes, thank you, Mark. And our point of view didn't quite align there.
Well, we got close. That's close. That's close. All right, there's Jim Jose, Professor of Politics on 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.